The mansion had been silent for 100 years, until a Navy SEAL's war dog froze at the door and refused to let anyone walk away. When Margaret Hale bought the abandoned mansion hidden in the Blue Ridge Mountains, she thought she was restoring an old home. But the first night, a retired Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd stopped at her gate, and the dog refused to enter the house. Trained to detect danger, the K9 sensed something buried beneath the floors. What they uncovered wasn't just history. It was a secret powerful men had spent decades trying to erase. Before we go further, comment 1 or 0 and tell us where you're watching from. The road into Wolf Hollow wound like a forgotten ribbon through the Blue Ridge Mountains, curling between hills where fog clung low against the ground and pine trees stood in silent rows. Margaret Hale drove slowly, her aging pickup truck rattling over loose gravel as if it, too, felt uncertain about the journey ahead. She had been on the road since sunrise. Colorado now sat nearly 2,000 miles behind her, along with the small house she had sold, the workshop where she restored antique furniture, and the hospital room where she had spent the final weeks beside her mother's bed. The mountains of North Carolina were greener than she expected. Taller, too. The kind of landscape that swallowed roads and kept secrets inside the forest. Her GPS had lost signal 30 minutes earlier, but she knew she was close. At the bend where the gravel road narrowed, Margaret spotted the rusted iron gate exactly where the property map said it would be. One side hung crookedly on its hinge. The other leaned against a stone pillar that had cracked down the middle long before she arrived. Beyond it stretched a long driveway choked with weeds. At the far end of that overgrown lane stood Briarwood House. Even from a distance, the mansion looked enormous. 3 stories tall with wide wooden porches and tall windows that stared out across the valley like empty eyes. The paint had peeled down to gray boards. Sections of the roof sagged where storms had done their work over the decades. 100 years of weather had turned the house into something halfway between a home and a ruin. Margaret cut the engine and sat quietly behind the wheel. For a long moment, she simply looked. This was it. Her fresh start. The property had appeared almost by accident during one late night of scrolling through online auction listings. 100-acre estate, historic structure, sold as is. Remote location, price far below market value. The description had included only 3 photographs. The first showed the house. The second showed the surrounding land. The third showed the back porch with a single rocking chair still sitting there, as if someone had stepped away and forgotten to return. Something about that last image had stayed with her. Now she was here. Margaret opened the truck door and stepped onto the gravel. The mountain air carried the scent of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a crow called once and then went quiet again. She walked slowly toward the gate. Grass brushed against her jeans as she pushed it open wide enough for the truck to pass through later. The metal hinge screamed with a rusty groan that echoed farther than she expected. For a moment, she wondered who might have heard it. Then she laughed softly to herself. No one lived close enough to notice. That had been part of the appeal. In Colorado, her life had been crowded with reminders. Her mother's empty bedroom, the silence at the kitchen table, the echo of hospital machines she sometimes still heard in the middle of the night. Out here, there would be nothing but mountains and work. And Margaret understood work. Restoring broken things had always made sense to her. Furniture that others threw away. Tables whose legs had snapped. Cabinets with drawers stuck shut for decades. She believed in patience, in sanding away damage until something strong and beautiful appeared underneath again. Maybe houses were not so different. The driveway stretched nearly half a mile from the gate to the mansion. Margaret decided to walk it first, before driving up. The ground sloped gently upward through a field that had once been farmland, but now looked more like wild meadow. Tall weeds swayed in the wind, brushing against old fence posts leaning sideways under vines. The mountains rose around the valley in quiet walls of dark green. Halfway up the drive, Margaret stopped and turned around. The road she had entered from was already disappearing beneath the fog. For the first time that day, she felt how alone the place truly was. Not frightening, just distant. She continued walking. The closer she came to the mansion, the larger it seemed. The front porch wrapped around both sides of the house, supported by white columns that had turned the color of bone with age. Several of the windows were boarded. Others were simply dark. The front door stood tall beneath an arched frame carved with patterns she could not quite make out from the ground. Margaret stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned under her boots, but it held. "All right," she murmured softly. "Let's see what you've got." She set her tool bag down and reached for the brass handle. But before she could open the door, something made her pause. A sound. Not from the house. From behind her. Margaret turned slowly. At the edge of the tree line, about 40 yards away, stood a German shepherd. The dog was large, powerful-looking, with dark fur along its back and lighter tan around the chest and legs. It stood perfectly still between two pines, watching her. Not barking, not moving, just observing. Margaret had grown up around dogs. She recognized the difference between curiosity and caution. This animal looked alert, focused. "Hey there," she called gently. The dog didn't approach. Its ears remained forward, eyes locked on the house behind her. Margaret glanced around for a collar or a person nearby, but the woods were empty. "Your place?" she asked the dog with a small smile. Still nothing. The wind moved through the trees, whispering softly along the ridge. Then Margaret noticed something else. Tire tracks, fresh ones. They ended near the gate she had opened minutes earlier. But they didn't belong to her truck. The marks were wider, deeper. Someone else had been here recently. Margaret turned back toward the dog. It had stepped forward now, just a few paces, still silent, still watching the house. For a brief second, the dog's gaze shifted from the mansion to her face. Then it returned to the dark windows behind her, as if it was listening for something inside. Margaret felt a strange chill move through her shoulders. "Guess I'm not the only one interested in the place," she said quietly. The dog blinked slowly. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the forest. Margaret stood there alone on the porch, staring at the empty trees. The house behind her creaked once in the wind. Far down the driveway, the fog thickened until the road vanished entirely. Wolf Hollow had welcomed her. But something else had noticed her arrival first. Margaret Hale stood on the porch of Briarwood House for another minute, staring at the place where the German shepherd had vanished into the forest. The trees were still again now, their branches shifting softly in the mountain wind. The dog was gone. Yet the feeling of being watched hadn't entirely left. Margaret finally turned back to the front door. The brass handle was cold against her palm as she pushed it open. The door resisted at first, then swung inward with a deep wooden groan that echoed through the dark interior. The smell hit her immediately. Old wood, dust, a faint trace of damp stone, but beneath it all was the quiet smell of age, the scent of a building that had simply been left alone too long. Margaret stepped inside slowly. The foyer stretched wide and tall, the ceiling rising nearly 20 feet above her. A chandelier hung crookedly in the center, its glass pieces dull beneath decades of dust. Sunlight slipped through tall windows along the staircase, casting long, pale lines across the floor. Despite the neglect, the house still carried a strange kind of dignity. Margaret knelt beside one of the floorboards and pressed gently with her knuckles. Solid oak. She smiled faintly. "Good bones," she whispered. For the next hour she walked through the mansion room by room, taking notes in a small leather notebook. The kitchen would need plumbing. The west hallway needed reinforcement beams. Several upstairs windows had shattered long ago, but the structure itself was stronger than she expected. By the time Margaret stepped back outside, the sun had slipped behind the mountains and shadows were stretching across the valley. She had just reached her truck to unload supplies when a distant rumble rolled across the sky. Thunder. The first drop of rain struck the hood of the truck a few seconds later. Within minutes, the sky opened. Mountain storms arrived quickly here. The rain came down hard and sudden, drumming against the metal roof of the pickup, while wind pushed through the hollow like a slow-moving wall. Margaret hurried to start the portable generator she had brought for temporary power. She pulled the starter cord once, twice, nothing. "Come on," she muttered. The engine coughed weakly and died. The rain grew heavier. Margaret wiped water from her eyes and tried again. The generator sputtered once more before falling silent. She exhaled sharply. Perfect. The mansion loomed behind her, its tall windows dark and lifeless as the storm rolled in. Margaret knelt down beside the machine, lifting the panel to inspect the fuel line. She worked quickly, but the fading daylight and pouring rain made it difficult to see. Somewhere across the field, a vehicle engine rumbled. Margaret looked up. Headlights appeared through the curtain of rain at the end of the driveway. A dark pickup truck rolled slowly up the gravel road toward the house, its tires crunching across the wet stones. The vehicle stopped near the porch. The driver stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered jacket and a dark ball cap pulled low over his eyes. Even from across the yard, Margaret could tell the man carried himself differently than most people. Still, balanced, alert. The same German shepherd from earlier jumped down from the passenger seat and landed beside him without a sound. The dog's coat glistened in the rain. Margaret stood up slowly. "Evening," the man called across the yard. His voice was calm but reserved. Margaret wiped her hands on her jeans. "Evening." The man approached the generator, crouching beside it without asking permission. His hands moved quickly over the machine, checking the fuel line, tapping the carburetor lightly with the handle of a wrench he pulled from his pocket. "You flooded it," he said simply. Margaret crossed her arms, rain dripping from her hair. "That's so." The man pulled the starter cord once. The generator roared to life instantly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Well," she admitted, "that's impressive." The man stood again, wiping grease from his fingers with a rag. "Name's Caleb Mercer," he said. Margaret nodded. "Margaret Hale." Caleb glanced toward the mansion. "You the new owner?" "Just arrived today." He studied the house for a moment without speaking. The German shepherd walked past him toward the porch. Halfway up the steps, the dog suddenly stopped. Its body went stiff. Its ears lifted sharply. Margaret noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong with him?" she asked. Caleb's expression shifted slightly. The dog stepped onto the porch and approached the front door Margaret had left open earlier. It didn't cross the threshold. Instead, the shepherd stood there staring into the house. Then it growled, low, deep, not aggressive, warning. Caleb's voice became quieter. "That's Atlas." Margaret looked back at the dog. "Atlas?" "Retired military K9. The dog didn't move. Its eyes were fixed somewhere deeper inside the mansion. Margaret frowned. He wasn't acting like that earlier. Caleb walked up the porch steps slowly. Atlas didn't look at him, still staring inside, still growling softly. Caleb crouched beside the dog, resting one hand on its shoulder. "What is it, boy?" Atlas took one careful step forward, then another. But the moment his paw reached the doorway, he stopped again. His head turned toward the eastern hallway of the house. The growl deepened. Margaret followed the direction of the dog's gaze. The hallway was empty, just darkness stretching into the quiet interior. "Maybe he smells raccoons or something," she suggested. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He watched Atlas closely. The dog's muscles were tight, alert, focused. Finally, Caleb stood again. "He's trained to detect explosives, hidden compartments, human remains," he said calmly. Margaret blinked. "Well, that's reassuring." Caleb gave a faint half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Atlas stepped backward off the porch, still watching the house, still uneasy. Caleb nodded toward the mansion. "He doesn't react like that without a reason." The rain continued to fall around them, whispering across the valley. Margaret glanced once more toward the dark hallway inside Briarwood House. For the first time since arriving, the place didn't feel quite as quiet as before, and Atlas Mercer refused to step inside. The storm rolled across Wolf Hollow through most of the night. Rain struck the roof of Briarwood House in long, steady sheets while wind pushed through the tall grass surrounding the mansion. Inside, Margaret lit a pair of lanterns and unrolled a sleeping bag near the fireplace in the main room. The generator hummed outside, but the house itself stayed dark and cavernous. Several times she thought about the dog standing frozen in the doorway. Atlas, a military K9 trained to detect things most people would never notice. Margaret tried to convince herself it had been nothing. Animals reacted strangely to new places sometimes. The house had probably sheltered raccoons or feral cats over the years. Still, when the wind rattled one of the upstairs windows sometime after midnight, she found herself sitting up and listening longer than she expected. Morning arrived wrapped in pale blue mist drifting across the valley. Margaret stepped outside with a mug of coffee and looked out across the hollow. The mountains rose in layered ridges, their tops still hidden beneath clouds that had not yet burned away. In daylight, the mansion looked less ominous, just old, just tired. She spent the morning unloading tools and basic supplies from the truck. Around noon, she decided she needed groceries, hardware supplies, and probably a few answers about the area. Caleb Mercer had mentioned a town nearby. Raven Creek. The drive took nearly 20 minutes along narrow mountain roads that twisted through thick forest before opening into a small valley town. Raven Creek looked exactly the way Margaret imagined it might. A single main street, a gas station with faded red pumps, a post office, 2 small shops, and a diner with a wooden sign swinging slowly above the door. Margaret parked along the curb and stepped inside. The bell above the diner door chimed softly. Conversation stopped almost instantly. 4 men sat at the counter drinking coffee. A young waitress carried plates toward a booth near the window. An elderly woman in a faded blue apron stood behind the register. Everyone looked at her. Margaret offered a polite smile. "Afternoon." One of the men at the counter nodded slowly, but didn't speak. Margaret slid onto a stool. "Coffee?" the younger waitress asked. "Yes, please." The cup arrived quickly. Margaret wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth settle in. "You passing through?" the waitress asked. "Actually, I just bought property up in Wolf Hollow." The moment the words left her mouth, the quiet inside the diner changed. One of the men coughed softly. Another set his coffee cup down a little too hard. "Which property?" the waitress asked carefully. "The old mansion," Margaret said. "Briarwood House." The elderly woman behind the counter finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp despite the deep wrinkles lining her face. You're the one who bought that place? She asked. Margaret nodded. Yes, ma'am. A long silence settled over the room. The older woman walked over slowly and set a small plate of biscuits beside Margaret's coffee. Name's Martha Lynn, she said. Been working this diner longer than most folks in town been alive. Margaret smiled politely. Margaret Hale. Martha studied her for a moment. You plan on staying up there? That's the idea. One of the men at the counter spoke without turning around. Most folks don't. Margaret glanced toward him. Why's that? The man shrugged. Winter's rough up there. Another man chuckled quietly. That house got a way of chasing people out before winter ever shows up. Martha Lynn shot the men a quick warning glance. That's enough, she said firmly. Margaret lifted an eyebrow. Sounds like Briarwood House has quite a reputation. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. That house has been empty a long time, she said. How long? Long enough for folks to stop asking questions. Margaret took a sip of coffee. Questions about what? Martha leaned a little closer. Her voice lowered slightly. About things that happened there. Before Margaret could respond, the diner door opened again. Cold mountain air rushed inside. Sheriff Dalton Reeves stepped through the doorway. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and a quiet, controlled presence. His badge caught the light as he removed his hat and nodded toward the people inside. Afternoon greetings passed around the room. Then the sheriff's eyes settled on Margaret. You must be the new resident up at Briarwood, he said. Margaret nodded. That obvious? Reeves smiled politely. News travels fast in a town this size. He pulled out the stool beside her. Sheriff Dalton Reeves. Margaret Hale. The sheriff accepted a cup of coffee from the waitress and rested his arms on the counter. Beautiful property up there, he said. It will be once I get some work done. Reeves took a slow sip of coffee. Well, he said calmly, just make sure you keep the sheriff's office number handy. Margaret tilted her head. Expecting trouble? Not exactly. Reeves glanced briefly toward Martha Lynn before continuing. Just saying that place has seen its share of complications. Margaret felt the same unease she'd sensed the night before, creeping back into the conversation. Complications like what? The sheriff gave a small shrug. Old properties sometimes carry old stories. Martha Lynn set another biscuit on Margaret's plate. Some stories best left buried, the older woman murmured quietly. The words hung in the air. Margaret finished her coffee and stood. Well, she said lightly, I've spent most of my life fixing broken things. She reached for her jacket. Guess we'll see if Briarwood House is any different. Outside, the afternoon sun had burned away the last of the fog. Margaret climbed into her truck and began the drive back toward Wolf Hollow. Halfway up the mountain road, she saw a familiar figure. Caleb Mercer stood beside his pickup near the edge of the forest. Atlas sat in the grass beside him. The moment Margaret's truck appeared, the German shepherd stood. Without hesitation, the dog started walking up the road toward Briarwood House. Caleb watched him go. Then he looked at Margaret as she slowed the truck beside him. Atlas does this every night, Caleb said. Margaret followed the dog with her eyes as it disappeared around the bend toward the mansion. He keeps coming back, she said. Caleb nodded. Yeah. His gaze shifted toward the mountains above Wolf Hollow. And when Atlas keeps returning to the same place, he said quietly, it usually means something's waiting there. High above them, Briarwood House sat alone on the ridge, and Atlas Mercer was already on his way back to it. Margaret watched the dog disappear around the bend in the road, his dark shape moving confidently through the tall grass, as if he knew the path better than anyone. Caleb Mercer leaned against the side of his truck, arms crossed loosely. "That dog's stubborn," Margaret said. Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not stubborn." "What then?" "Certain." Margaret looked up the winding road toward the ridge. Even from this distance, she could see the top of the mansion rising above the tree line. "You really think he senses something up there?" she asked. Caleb took a slow breath before answering. "Atlas doesn't guess," he said quietly. "He's trained to notice what people miss." Margaret considered that. "Well," she said after a moment, "if he's going to keep visiting my house, I suppose I should at least find out what he's so interested in." Caleb pushed away from the truck. "Let's go then." They drove the rest of the way together. When Margaret's pickup rolled into the clearing near the mansion, Atlas was already waiting at the front steps. The German Shepherd stood tall on the porch, his ears forward, his attention fixed once again toward the same dark interior hallway. The dog didn't bark. He simply waited. Caleb stepped out of the truck and walked up the porch slowly. Atlas moved aside to let him pass, but remained close, almost like a shadow following its handler. Margaret joined them at the door. "So," she said lightly, "what exactly are we looking for?" Caleb studied the hallway inside. "Anything that doesn't belong." The three of them entered the house. Daylight streamed through the tall windows now, lighting the foyer enough to reveal the intricate woodwork carved along the staircase railing and door frames. Dust floated lazily through the beams of sunlight. Atlas walked ahead slowly. Every few steps he paused, sniffing the air. Margaret noticed how quiet Caleb moved beside him. The man walked through the house with careful awareness, eyes scanning corners, ceilings, doorways. It reminded her of someone entering unfamiliar territory. Which, she realized, was exactly what he was doing. Atlas reached the eastern hallway, the same place he had reacted to the night before. He stopped, his nose lifted. Then he stepped forward. Margaret followed cautiously. The hallway stretched longer than she remembered from her earlier walkthrough. Several doors lined both sides. Most were closed. One hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Atlas moved halfway down the corridor before turning sharply toward the wall. He sat. Caleb crouched beside him. "What is it, boy?" Atlas lifted one paw and tapped the floor. Once. Then again. Margaret frowned. "He's pawing at the boards." Caleb stood slowly. "Help me move this rug." There was a narrow, faded rug running along the center of the hallway floor. Together they pulled it aside, revealing dark oak boards beneath. Caleb crouched and knocked lightly on the wood. Thump, thump. Then, a hollow sound. He knocked again. The same empty echo answered. Margaret felt her curiosity spike. "That doesn't sound right." Caleb ran his hand along the boards carefully. His fingers stopped at a faint metal ring set into the floor near the wall, almost hidden beneath years of dust. "Well," Margaret said softly, "that definitely doesn't belong in a hallway." Caleb hooked 2 fingers through the ring and pulled. At first the wood didn't move. Then the panel lifted with a long creak. Cold air rose from the opening beneath the floor. Margaret leaned closer. A narrow stone passage stretched below them, disappearing into darkness beneath the house. For a moment, none of them spoke. Atlas stood immediately and moved to the edge of the opening. His body went rigid again. Margaret stared down the hidden corridor. "You're telling me that's been under my house this whole time?" Caleb grabbed a flashlight from his jacket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough stone walls and a dirt floor that sloped gently downward. "This passage wasn't built with the house," Caleb said quietly. "How can you tell?" "Stonework's different. Margaret looked again. He was right. The mansion above used wood and brick construction, but this tunnel looked older, cruder. Atlas jumped down into the passage without hesitation. "Atlas!" Caleb started, but the dog was already moving deeper inside. Margaret climbed down carefully behind him. The air below felt colder, damp. They followed Atlas through the narrow corridor. After about 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a slightly wider chamber beneath the center of the house. Old wooden crates lay scattered along one wall. Several had collapsed long ago. Burned scraps of paper littered the floor. Margaret knelt beside one of the crates and brushed away dust. "These look recent," she said. "Not recent," Caleb replied. "But not 100 years old either." Atlas had stopped again. The German shepherd stood facing a wall at the far end of the chamber, his tail stiff, his head low. Margaret raised the lantern she had brought down. "What's he looking at?" Caleb walked forward slowly. Then he saw it. A steel door. It had been set directly into the stone wall, heavy, industrial, completely out of place beneath a century-old mansion. Margaret stepped closer. "That doesn't look old at all." Caleb's flashlight moved across the door. The hinges, the locking mechanism, the reinforced frame. His voice dropped. "Because it isn't." Margaret looked at him. "You recognize it?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the door. His hand brushed lightly over the metal latch. His jaw tightened. "Military design," he said quietly. Margaret felt the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. A military door, hidden under a mountain mansion? Caleb's eyes stayed on the steel surface. "Which means someone didn't just hide this place." Atlas growled softly behind them. Caleb finished the sentence without looking away. "They sealed something inside." The words lingered in the underground chamber like the echo of a distant door closing. Margaret stepped closer to the steel door. Up close, the metal surface showed scratches and small dents, the kind that came from tools striking it again and again over the years. Someone had tried to open it before. "Who would build something like this under a house?" she asked quietly. Caleb crouched near the hinges, running his fingers along the edge of the frame. "This wasn't built for a house," he said. "This was built to hold something." Atlas stood beside him, staring at the door with unblinking focus. Margaret felt the cool, damp air creeping through her sleeves. "Can it be opened?" Caleb studied the latch mechanism. "It's not locked," he said after a moment. Margaret blinked. "Then why hasn't anyone opened it?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood slowly and looked around the chamber again. The broken crates, the scattered ash from burned papers, the faint marks in the dirt that might once have been footprints, long since erased by time. "This place was hidden for a reason," he said. Atlas suddenly turned his head sharply toward the passage behind them. A low growl rolled through his chest. Margaret froze. "What is it?" The dog's ears stood straight as he stared toward the tunnel leading back up to the house. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the faint sound came, a floorboard creaking somewhere above them. Margaret felt the hairs rise on her arms. "That was upstairs," she whispered. Caleb grabbed the flashlight tighter. "Stay here," he said. "No chance," Margaret replied instantly. Atlas was already moving toward the passage. Caleb followed quickly. They climbed back through the tunnel and pushed the floor panel open again. The hallway above looked exactly the same as before. Quiet. Still. But Atlas moved immediately toward the staircase, his nose low, his body tense. Margaret followed Caleb carefully through the house. The staircase groaned softly beneath their weight as they climbed. Sunlight from the tall windows had shifted now, throwing long shadows across the second-floor landing. Atlas stopped halfway down the upper hall. He sniffed the air, then moved toward a door at the far end. The door stood slightly open. Margaret frowned. That door was closed earlier. Caleb stepped forward slowly and pushed it wider. The room inside looked like it might once have been a study. Bookshelves lined the walls. Most were empty now except for a few dusty volumes scattered on the floor. The window had been cracked open. The curtain moved gently in the mountain breeze. Atlas walked to the window and sniffed the sill. Caleb examined the floor. Boot prints. Faint but visible in the dust. Fresh. Margaret's stomach tightened. Someone was here. Caleb nodded once. Recently. She looked toward the trees outside the window. Do you think they saw us go into the tunnel? Caleb straightened. Maybe. Atlas suddenly barked once and ran back into the hallway. The dog raced down the stairs and out the front door. Margaret and Caleb followed. They stepped onto the porch just in time to hear the distant roar of an engine. A dark SUV tore down the gravel road below the ridge, disappearing quickly into the forest. Margaret stared after it. Were they watching the house? Caleb didn't answer right away. Atlas stood at the edge of the porch, staring down the road long after the vehicle vanished. Finally, Caleb spoke. Someone knew about that room, he said. Margaret crossed her arms tightly. And they didn't want us finding it. Caleb looked back toward the house. The quiet mountain breeze moved across the empty field surrounding Briarwood House. But the peaceful view no longer felt the same. Tonight, Caleb said quietly, we find out what's behind that door. Margaret nodded. The sun slowly lowered behind the mountain ridge. By nightfall, the shadows inside the mansion would stretch deeper than before, and beneath the house the sealed room would finally be opened. But somewhere beyond the trees, someone else now knew the secret had been discovered. And they were already watching. The sun slipped behind the ridge as evening settled over Wolf Hollow. Long shadows stretched across the tall grass surrounding Briarwood House, and the air turned cooler as the mountain wind began to move through the valley. Margaret stood on the front porch holding a lantern, while Caleb checked the beam of his flashlight. Atlas lay near the steps, watching the forest with the calm patience of a soldier on guard duty. Neither of them had spoken much since the SU-5 sped away. Margaret finally broke the silence. You think whoever that was will come back? Caleb didn't look up from his gear. If they know what's down there, he said quietly, they won't stay away. Margaret glanced toward the darkening woods. Then maybe we shouldn't open that door tonight. Caleb clicked the flashlight off and slid it into his pocket. That door's been sealed for decades, he said. If someone's been protecting whatever's inside, it means it matters. Margaret studied his face. And you want to know why? Caleb met her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. They returned to the hallway together. Atlas stood immediately and followed them inside. The mansion felt different now. The silence no longer seemed peaceful. It felt like the quiet inside a place that had been waiting too long to speak. Caleb pulled the rug aside again and lifted the floor panel. The narrow stone passage below breathed out a cold draft, as if the earth itself was exhaling. Atlas jumped down first. Margaret followed carefully with the lantern. Caleb came last, pulling the panel closed above them. The underground chamber waited exactly as they had left it. Crates, ash, the steel door. Margaret stepped closer to the metal surface. Up close, faint numbers had been stamped into the frame, military markings worn thin with time. Caleb noticed them too. Cold War era, he murmured. Margaret frowned. You can tell from that? Spent enough time around this kind of equipment. Atlas approached the door again. The dog sniffed the edges slowly before stepping back. Then he sat, watching. Caleb placed his hand against the metal. The steel was cold, heavy. Ready? He asked quietly. Margaret raised the lantern higher. Let's see what someone worked so hard to hide. Caleb grabbed the latch and pulled. At first the door resisted. The hinges groaned loudly as rust broke free. Then the steel swung open with a deep grinding sound that echoed through the chamber. A gust of stale air drifted from the darkness beyond. Margaret stepped inside first with the lantern. The room beyond was larger than she expected. The walls were reinforced concrete. Shelves lined the far side, stacked with sealed metal containers and cardboard archive boxes. A wooden table sat in the center of the room beneath a hanging lamp that had long since gone dark. Dust coated everything, but nothing inside had been destroyed. Caleb walked slowly along the shelves. Maps of the Blue Ridge Mountains hung on one wall, marked with faded red circles and handwritten notes. Old military radios sat on another table beside stacks of documents tied together with string. Margaret opened one of the boxes. Inside were folders stamped with faded government seals. This isn't just storage, she said quietly. It's evidence. Atlas moved to the table in the center of the room. His nose hovered above something lying beneath the dust. Caleb brushed the surface clean. A photograph. The image showed a group of uniformed officers standing outside Briarwood House decades earlier. The mansion looked younger then. The paint was bright. The fields around it were still farmland. Margaret leaned closer. Military? Caleb didn't answer. He stared at the man standing in the center of the photograph. A Marine officer, tall, broad shoulders, calm expression. Something about the man's face felt familiar. Caleb turned the photo slowly. On the back, a name had been written in black ink. Daniel Mercer. The flashlight slipped slightly in Caleb's hand. Margaret saw the change in his expression. You know him? Caleb's voice came out quieter than before. That's my father. Margaret blinked. But you said he was declared a traitor, Caleb finished. The words sounded bitter. My entire life. He stared at the photograph again. The Marine officer in the image stood proudly in front of Briarwood House. Nothing about the man looked like a traitor. Caleb opened one of the nearby folders with slow hands. Inside were typed reports, coded transmissions, and handwritten notes. Margaret watched his eyes move across the pages. What does it say? Caleb swallowed once before answering. He wasn't working against the military. Margaret leaned closer. Then what was he doing here? Caleb turned another page. Maps, names, locations circled deep within the mountain region. He was investigating something. What kind of investigation? Caleb closed the folder slowly. Illegal weapons trafficking. Margaret stared at the stacks of documents filling the room. All hidden under a mountain mansion? Caleb looked back at the photograph. They buried the evidence here. Atlas moved closer and sat beside Caleb. The dog rested quietly at his side. Caleb stared at his father's face in the photograph. For 30 years he had carried the weight of a name the military called disgrace. Now the truth was sitting on a table beneath Briarwood House, and it had been waiting there the entire time. But somewhere outside the mountains, the people who helped bury that truth were still alive, and now they knew the door had been opened. The underground room beneath Briarwood House had gone completely silent. Margaret stood near the shelves of sealed evidence boxes, holding the lantern steady, while Caleb remained seated beside the wooden table. The photograph of Daniel Mercer rested in his hands. Atlas lay close to Caleb's boots, calm but watchful, his dark eyes moving slowly around the room as if guarding it. For several minutes, no one spoke. The weight of the discovery seemed to press against the concrete walls. Margaret finally broke the silence. "You said the military called him a traitor." Caleb nodded faintly without looking up. "They said he sold classified information," he said quietly. "Said he disappeared with government property and vanished." Margaret glanced around the room. "All of this?" Caleb turned another page in the file he had opened. "These reports say something different." He slid the folder across the table so Margaret could see. Typed documents filled the pages, stamped with faded seals and dates from the late 1970s. Margaret read the first paragraph slowly. "Joint investigation. Illegal weapons shipments moving through Appalachian supply routes." Her voice trailed off as she scanned the next page. "These are military reports." Caleb nodded. "My father was assigned to track stolen equipment moving through private transport companies," he said. Margaret flipped through more pages. The reports listed coded shipment routes, locations deep in the mountains, and names of companies she had never heard of. "Someone was smuggling weapons through this region," she said quietly. "And the investigation brought him here," Caleb replied. Margaret looked around the room again. "So he hid the evidence." Caleb leaned back against the concrete wall. "Looks like he planned to turn it over." Margaret studied the documents. "But something stopped him." Caleb said nothing. Atlas shifted slightly, resting his head on Caleb's leg. The dog had done that many times before. After firefights overseas, after long patrols when silence settled over a team that had lost someone. Caleb placed one hand gently on the dog's neck. "Military said he ran," he said quietly. Margaret watched him. "Do you believe that?" Caleb shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." Margaret opened another box. Inside were cassette tapes, small notebooks, and sealed envelopes marked confidential. She picked up one of the notebooks and flipped it open. Handwritten notes filled the pages. Coordinates, times, names. One name had been circled several times. Margaret read it aloud. "Grayson." Caleb looked up. "What?" Margaret turned the notebook so he could see. "Grayson Logistics." Caleb's expression darkened. "Grayson," he repeated slowly. Margaret remembered something. In town, Sheriff Reeves mentioned a family that owned a lot of property around here. Caleb nodded. "Harold Grayson. The landowner? Owns half the valley." Margaret looked back at the notes. This notebook mentions supply trucks and weapons shipments moving through a company with his name on it. Caleb stared at the pages. So my father discovered something big. Margaret closed the notebook slowly. And someone buried it. The room fell quiet again. Caleb looked back down at the photograph of his father. For most of his life, that name had carried shame. Teachers had whispered about it when he was a kid. Military instructors had seen it on his record. Some had wondered if betrayal ran in the blood. Caleb had spent years proving it didn't. He joined the Navy. He fought through the toughest training programs in the country. He became a SEAL. And still the shadow of Daniel Mercer followed him everywhere. Atlas nudged Caleb's hand gently. The dog's quiet loyalty had been the one thing that never questioned him. Margaret stepped closer. "What are you thinking?" Caleb stared at the photograph. "My father didn't run," he said quietly. Margaret waited. "He hid the evidence because someone powerful was involved." She nodded. "And they needed to silence him." Caleb set the photograph down carefully. He must have known they were coming. Margaret looked at the shelves of documents. "Which is why he left all of this here." Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears sharpened. Caleb noticed immediately. "What is it?" The dog stood. He moved toward the doorway of the room and stared down the dark passage. Margaret listened. At first, she heard nothing. Then, a faint sound. Above them, a slow creak in the floorboards of the house. Caleb reached for his flashlight. Someone's inside. Margaret's heart began to pound. Already. Atlas growled low in his throat. Caleb turned the flashlight off and motioned toward the passage. Lights out. Margaret lowered the lantern flame until the room dimmed. Footsteps echoed faintly above them. Not many. One person. Maybe two. Atlas moved silently beside Caleb as they stepped back toward the hidden corridor. The creak of boards continued above their heads. Someone was walking through Briarwood House. Searching. And now that the truth about Daniel Mercer had begun to surface, it was clear that whoever was upstairs had come for the same reason: to make sure that truth never reached daylight. The footsteps above moved slowly across the old floorboards of Briarwood House. Caleb stood motionless in the underground passage, his hand resting lightly on Atlas's back. The German shepherd was perfectly still beside him, muscles tight, ears forward. Margaret held the lantern close to her chest. The flame lowered until only a dim glow touched the stone walls. The sound above them stopped. Then came the faint scrape of a chair moving somewhere in the house. Caleb leaned closer to Margaret. "One person," he whispered. "How can you tell?" "Weight of the steps." Atlas let out a low breath through his nose. Caleb waited another moment. Then the footsteps began again, moving toward the hallway where the hidden panel lay. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "He's heading this way." Caleb nodded, which means he knows about the passage. They moved deeper into the tunnel, just out of sight of the floor opening. A moment later, the creak of the hallway rug being pulled aside echoed faintly through the boards above them. Then silence. Someone stood directly over the hidden panel. Atlas's growl vibrated softly through the tunnel. Margaret held her breath. The metal ring above scraped once, then stopped. A long pause followed. Finally, the rug slid back across the floor. Footsteps retreated down the hallway. Caleb waited several more minutes before speaking. "He's gone." Margaret exhaled slowly. "You think he realized someone was down here?" "Maybe," Caleb said. "Or maybe he just confirmed the door was open." Atlas turned his head toward the tunnel exit again. The dog's posture had relaxed slightly. Caleb nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's move." They climbed out of the passage carefully and pushed the panel back into place. The mansion above them was quiet again, but the dust on the hallway floor had changed. Fresh boot prints led toward the staircase. Margaret studied them. "Same prints from earlier." Caleb nodded. He came back to check. They walked to the front porch together. Outside, night had settled fully across the mountains. The stars above Wolf Hollow shone brightly through the clear sky. Margaret leaned against one of the old wooden columns. "So whoever's behind this has been watching the house." Caleb looked toward the valley road. "Watching it for years, probably." Margaret crossed her arms. "You said the name Grayson was in those notes." Caleb nodded. "And the biggest landowner around here is Harold Grayson." Margaret thought about the diner, the quiet looks, the way conversation had stopped when she mentioned Briarwood House. "Everyone in town knows something," she said slowly. Caleb didn't disagree. "The question is, who's protecting the secret?" Margaret looked toward the dark mountains surrounding Raven Creek. "Sheriff Reeves?" Caleb's expression remained neutral. "Maybe." The wind moved softly across the porch. Margaret turned back toward the house. What do we do with the evidence? Caleb thought for a moment. We make copies. Copies? If someone tries to destroy what's here, the truth survives. Margaret nodded slowly. And then? Caleb looked out across the hollow. Then we find out who's been burying it. The next morning arrived with heavy gray clouds rolling across the mountains. Margaret drove into Raven Creek early. This time the diner was quieter. Martha Lynn stood behind the counter again, pouring coffee. The older woman looked up when Margaret entered. You didn't sleep much last night, Martha said gently. Margaret sat at the counter. No. Martha set a mug in front of her. Briarwood House has a way of doing that. Margaret took a sip. Tell me about Harold Grayson. The older woman froze slightly. Her eyes shifted toward the window before returning to Margaret. Why are you asking that name? Margaret kept her voice calm. Just curious. Martha leaned closer across the counter. That family's been here longer than most of us, she said quietly. They own land all over the valley. Margaret nodded. I've heard. Martha lowered her voice further. People in Raven Creek learned a long time ago not to ask too many questions about what goes on around here. Margaret held her gaze. Because of Grayson? Martha hesitated. Then she sighed. Because of the kind of trouble that follows people who dig too deep. The diner door opened suddenly. Sheriff Dalton Reeves stepped inside. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he approached the counter. Morning greetings passed quickly. Then his eyes landed on Margaret. You settling in all right up at Briarwood? He asked casually. Margaret held his gaze. Starting to. Reeves nodded slowly. You'll find folks around here value their quiet. Margaret placed her coffee cup down carefully. I've noticed. The sheriff's expression remained polite. But his eyes had changed slightly. Margaret felt it immediately. The same quiet tension she had sensed the night before. Reeves leaned his elbows on the counter. That old mansion has been empty a long time, he said calmly. Sometimes empty places are better left that way. Margaret didn't respond. She simply stood and placed money on the counter. Outside, Caleb waited beside his truck. Atlas sat calmly in the passenger seat. Margaret climbed in. Well? Caleb asked. Margaret looked back at the diner window. Sheriff Reeves stood inside watching them leave. This town doesn't want the truth coming out, she said quietly. Caleb started the engine. That makes two of us, he replied. Atlas looked back toward the mountains as they drove. High above Raven Creek, Briarwood House waited on the ridge, but the deeper they dug into its secrets, the more the entire town seemed determined to bury them again. By late afternoon, the clouds had rolled low over Wolf Hollow again, turning the sky the color of dull steel. Wind pushed through the valley in long, restless waves, bending the tall grass around Briarwood House. Margaret sat at the long wooden table inside the underground room, while Caleb carefully sorted through the documents they had discovered. A small battery lantern illuminated the papers while Atlas lay near the doorway, keeping watch on the tunnel. Stacks of copied pages had begun to grow. Names, routes, dates. Each sheet added another piece to the story Daniel Mercer had died trying to expose. Margaret rubbed her temples. This is bigger than we thought, she said quietly. Caleb nodded. These shipments weren't small, he replied. Military-grade weapons moving through private transport routes. Margaret looked at the notes again. And Grayson Logistics appears in almost every file. Caleb closed one folder slowly. My father must have discovered who was behind it. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears sharpened toward the tunnel. Caleb froze. The dog rose to his feet without making a sound. What is it? Margaret whispered. Atlas walked slowly toward the tunnel entrance, nose low to the ground. Then he stopped. A faint sound drifted through the passage. The creak of the mansion's front door. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone's inside." Margaret's pulse jumped. "Again?" Atlas growled softly. Caleb turned off the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed the room except for the faint glow of Caleb's flashlight covered by his hand. Footsteps echoed faintly through the floor above. Not careful this time. Whoever had entered wasn't sneaking. They were searching. Drawers opening, furniture moving. Margaret swallowed. "They're tearing the place apart." Caleb stood slowly. "They're looking for this room." Atlas moved toward the tunnel. Caleb followed with careful steps. Margaret stayed close behind them. They reached the bottom of the passage and paused beneath the floor panel. The noise above grew louder. Boots crossed the hallway, then stopped directly above them. Margaret held her breath. The rug shifted. The metal ring scraped. The panel began to lift. Caleb grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her deeper into the tunnel shadows. The panel opened halfway. Light from a flashlight cut down into the passage. A man's voice echoed above. "Nothing down here." Another voice answered from the hallway. "Check the other rooms." The panel slammed shut again. Atlas let out a low rumble. Caleb waited until the footsteps moved away. Then he whispered, "They're not done searching." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "How many?" "2. Maybe 3. The footsteps continued moving through the house above them. Doors slammed. Furniture scraped. Then suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Glass breaking. Margaret flinched. That sounded like the kitchen. Caleb clenched his jaw. "If they find the passage, this place becomes a trap." Atlas looked up at him. The dog understood. Caleb gave a quiet command. "Stay close." They climbed back through the panel. The hallway was empty, but the sound of footsteps came from the far end of the house. 2 men. Margaret could hear them speaking now. "Boss said everything gets burned if we find it. Relax, nobody's here." Caleb moved silently toward the staircase with Atlas at his side. Margaret followed. The voices came from the living room. Caleb stopped at the corner. He peered around carefully. 2 men stood near the fireplace. One carried a crowbar. The other held a pistol while scanning the room. The crowbar slammed into a cabinet, splintering wood. Atlas's muscles tightened. Caleb whispered one quiet word. "Easy." Then the floorboard beneath Margaret's boot creaked. Both men spun toward the hallway. "Hey!" The man with the pistol raised the weapon. Atlas exploded forward. The German shepherd launched down the hallway like a streak of muscle and fur, slamming into the gunman before he could fire. The pistol went off with a deafening crack. Margaret screamed. Atlas tackled the man to the floor, teeth clamping down on his arm as the weapon skidded across the hardwood. Caleb rushed forward and drove his shoulder into the second man, sending the crowbar flying. The 2 men struggled violently in the narrow room. Atlas held the gunman pinned, but another shot rang out. The sound echoed through the house. Then Atlas collapsed. "Atlas!" Caleb dropped to his knees beside the dog. A dark stain spread across the shepherd's side. The wounded intruder scrambled to his feet and ran for the door. The second man followed him, limping badly. Within seconds, their vehicle roared to life outside. The SUV tore down the gravel road and vanished into the forest. Margaret ran to Caleb. Atlas lay on the floor, breathing hard. Caleb pressed his hand against the wound. "Stay with me, boy," he whispered urgently. The dog's eyes blinked slowly. Margaret grabbed a blanket from the couch. "We have to move him." Caleb lifted Atlas carefully into his arms. Rain had begun to fall again outside. Caleb carried the wounded dog through the storm toward his truck. Margaret climbed into the passenger seat. "Veterinary clinic," she said quickly. "There's one near the lake outside town." Caleb slammed the door and started the engine. The truck roared down the mountain road as rain poured across the windshield. Atlas lay across Caleb's lap, breathing shallow but steady. Caleb kept one hand on the steering wheel. The other rested against the dog's neck. "Hang on," he whispered. Lightning flashed across the mountains as the truck raced through the dark, because Atlas Mercer had already saved Caleb's life once before. And tonight, Caleb refused to let his partner die protecting him again. The truck tore down the mountain road like a storm of its own. Rain hammered the windshield, while lightning flashed over the dark ridges surrounding Wolf Hollow. The narrow road twisted sharply through the forest, but Caleb Mercer barely slowed. Atlas lay across the bench seat beside him, wrapped tightly in Margaret's blanket. The dog's breathing was shallow. Each rise and fall of his chest felt like a fragile promise. Margaret pressed both hands against the wound in Atlas's side, trying to slow the bleeding. "Stay with us," she whispered softly. Caleb's knuckles had turned white on the steering wheel. Every turn of the road brought another memory rushing back. Dusty patrol roads in Afghanistan. Gunfire echoing across rocky hills. The moment Atlas had tackled an insurgent seconds before a hidden explosive could detonate beneath Caleb's team. That dog had saved his life, more than once. The truck skidded slightly as they reached the edge of Raven Creek. Caleb swung hard onto the road leading toward the lake outside town. A small building appeared ahead through the rain. A wooden sign stood beside the driveway. Lakeside Animal Clinic. Caleb slammed the brakes and jumped out before the truck had fully stopped. "Help!" Margaret shouted as she pushed open her door. The clinic lights flicked on almost immediately. A middle-aged veterinarian rushed outside wearing a raincoat. "What happened?" "Gunshot wound," Caleb said quickly. The vet's expression tightened, but he didn't waste time. "Bring him inside." They rushed through the clinic doors. Bright lights flooded the small examination room as the vet placed Atlas on the surgical table. "Bullet went through the side," Margaret explained breathlessly. The vet examined the wound carefully. "You got him here fast," he said. Caleb stood beside the table, rainwater dripping from his jacket. "Can you save him?" The veterinarian hesitated. "The bullet missed the lungs," he said slowly, "but there's internal bleeding." Caleb felt the words settle in his chest like cold metal. "We'll need surgery immediately." Margaret stepped back as the vet began preparing equipment. "Wait outside," the vet said firmly. Caleb didn't move. The vet looked at him again. "I promise we'll do everything we can." After a long moment, Caleb nodded and stepped back. The door to the surgery room closed. Silence filled the hallway. Margaret sat in one of the chairs along the wall. Caleb remained standing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The rain outside softened to a quiet drizzle tapping against the windows. Margaret glanced toward Caleb. "You should sit down." Caleb shook his head. His eyes remained fixed on the closed door. Atlas had been beside him for 6 years. Through deployments, through sleepless nights after returning home, through the long, quiet days when the world felt too loud for a soldier who had seen too much. That dog had carried more than orders. He had carried Caleb through the hardest parts of coming home. Margaret finally spoke again. "You know he'll fight," she said softly. Caleb exhaled slowly. "He always does." Another hour passed. The clinic clock ticked loudly on the wall. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Outside, fog drifted across the lake in pale gray waves. When she turned back, Caleb had finally taken a seat. His elbows rested on his knees, hands clasped together. Margaret walked over quietly. "You're not alone in this," she said. Caleb looked up. "You barely know me." Margaret gave a small, tired smile. I know what loyalty looks like. Before Caleb could respond, the surgery door opened. The veterinarian stepped out. His mask hung loosely around his neck. Caleb stood instantly. Well? He asked. The vet wiped his hands with a towel. The bullet passed clean through, he said. Margaret leaned forward. That's good, right? The vet nodded. He lost a lot of blood, but we stopped the bleeding. Caleb waited. And? The vet smiled faintly. He's going to make it. Relief washed across Caleb's face so quickly it almost looked like exhaustion. Margaret laughed softly under her breath. Thank God. The vet gestured toward the recovery room. He'll need rest for a few days, but he's strong. Caleb stepped inside slowly. Atlas lay on a padded bed beneath a warm blanket. Bandages wrapped around his side. The dog lifted his head weakly when Caleb approached. Hey, partner, Caleb whispered. Atlas thumped his tail once against the blanket. Caleb knelt beside him and rested his hand gently against the dog's neck. You did good. Atlas closed his eyes again. Margaret stood quietly near the doorway. For the first time since the gunshot echoed through Briarwood House, the tension inside the room began to ease. But Caleb knew the night had changed something. Someone had tried to destroy the evidence beneath the mansion. Someone powerful enough to send armed men into Wolf Hollow. He stood slowly and looked out the clinic window toward the mountains. We finish what my father started, he said quietly. Margaret joined him. And how do we do that? Caleb's voice was calm now. By making sure the truth comes out. Behind them, Atlas slept peacefully. Outside, the storm clouds over Raven Creek began to break. But the real storm, the one waiting at Briarwood House, was only beginning. 3 days passed before Atlas was strong enough to stand again. The bandage along his side wrapped tight around his ribs, and the veterinarian had been clear. No running, no jumping, no strain. Atlas ignored the last instruction almost immediately. On the third morning, he limped slowly out of the clinic, tail low but steady, and sat beside Caleb's truck as if he had already decided where they were going. Back to the ridge. Margaret stepped out of the clinic behind them. You're really taking him up there? She asked carefully. Caleb crouched beside Atlas and checked the bandage once more. He won't stay behind, Caleb said. Atlas gave a quiet huff through his nose. Margaret looked down at the dog. You realize you're supposed to be resting. Atlas looked up at her with patient eyes. Caleb smiled faintly. That's his version of resting. The drive back toward Wolf Hollow was quiet. Fog clung low to the mountain roads, and the sky carried the pale gray light of early winter. By the time they reached the long gravel drive leading up to Briarwood House, the wind had begun to rise again. Margaret slowed the truck. Something felt wrong. The front gate stood open. They had left it closed. Caleb noticed immediately. Stop here, he said. Margaret cut the engine. Atlas stepped out of the truck carefully. His injured side slowed him, but his focus remained sharp. Caleb scanned the valley through binoculars. Nothing moved in the fields below. But the mansion itself told a different story. One of the upstairs windows had been smashed. Margaret felt the chill run through her chest. They came back. Caleb nodded once. Probably more than once. Atlas began walking toward the house. Caleb followed. Margaret stayed close behind. The front porch creaked beneath their boots. The door stood half open. Inside, Briarwood House looked like a battlefield. Drawers had been torn out. Chairs overturned. Bookshelves emptied across the floor. They had searched everything. Atlas moved slowly through the hallway. His nose lowered to the ground, tracing scent across the floorboards. Caleb followed the dog's lead. They were looking for the passage again, Margaret said. Or the documents, Caleb replied. Atlas stopped at the living room. His ears twitched. Then he looked toward the back door. Caleb stepped forward carefully and opened it. Fresh tire tracks cut deep into the muddy ground outside. More than one vehicle. Margaret counted silently. 3 trucks. Caleb's voice hardened. They're coming back. Almost on cue, a distant engine echoed up the mountain road. Margaret turned toward the ridge. Headlights appeared between the trees. Then another pair, and another. 3 black trucks climbed the road toward Briarwood House. Atlas growled. Caleb's eyes sharpened. They're early. Margaret looked at him. What do we do? Caleb moved quickly. Get the documents. Margaret ran toward the hallway. The hidden panel lifted easily this time. She climbed down into the tunnel and grabbed the metal cases filled with copied files. Above her, footsteps moved quickly through the house. Caleb pulled boards loose from the broken furniture and dragged them into the hallway. What are you doing? Margaret called. Caleb's voice stayed calm. Turning this place into a maze. The trucks rolled into the clearing outside. Doors slammed. Boots hit gravel. Voices echoed across the yard. Atlas stood beside Caleb, body tense despite the bandage along his side. Easy, Caleb whispered. 3 men stepped onto the porch. Behind them came another figure, older, tall, a long coat draped across his shoulders. Harold Grayson. The landowner removed his hat slowly. So, he called inside the house, you finally found what you weren't supposed to. Caleb stepped into the hallway where the man could see him. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly. Mercer, he said. Caleb said nothing. Grayson stepped inside. You should have left that house alone. Margaret emerged from the tunnel carrying the metal cases. Funny thing about buried truths, she said. They tend to surface eventually. Grayson's expression darkened. Those files belong to people who know how to keep them quiet. Caleb took 1 step forward. My father died protecting them. Grayson's smile faded. Yes, he said quietly. He did. Atlas moved slightly in front of Caleb. The dog's stance was protective. 3 armed men spread out behind Grayson. The wind outside began to rise again, rattling the broken windows of the mansion. Margaret gripped the case tighter. You're not leaving with this. Grayson sighed. You misunderstand. He raised a hand. We're not here to take them. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Grayson's voice dropped. We're here to erase them. The men behind him stepped forward. Atlas barked sharply. Caleb moved. The hallway exploded into motion. Atlas lunged toward the nearest intruder, knocking the man sideways into a broken cabinet. Caleb disarmed another with a swift strike, sending the pistol skidding across the floor. Margaret ran for the front porch carrying the cases. Gunshots echoed through the house. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. But Caleb moved through the chaos like the soldier he had trained to be. Within seconds, 2 of the intruders were down. The third fled toward the trucks outside. Grayson stood frozen in the doorway. Caleb stopped a few feet away from him. The storm wind howled through the broken windows. Atlas stood beside Caleb again, breathing hard but steady. Grayson looked between them. Then he slowly lowered his head. You've made a very expensive mistake, he said. Caleb's voice was quiet. No, he replied. You did. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Grayson's eyes widened. Margaret stepped onto the porch holding a phone. Sheriff Reeves is on his way. Grayson looked out across the valley. For the first time since arriving, the powerful landowner seemed uncertain. Because the storm that had once buried Daniel Mercer's truth was finally breaking apart, and Briarwood House had become the place where it would all come to light. The sound of sirens climbed the mountain road minutes later. Red and blue lights flashed between the trees as Sheriff Dalton Reeves's patrol truck pulled into the clearing in front of the mansion. 2 deputies followed behind him. Harold Grayson stood on the porch steps with his hands folded calmly in front of him, though the tension in his jaw told a different story. Inside the house, broken furniture and scattered debris marked the path of the confrontation that had just taken place. Caleb stood near the doorway with Atlas beside him. The German shepherd's bandaged side rose and fell steadily as he watched the vehicles arrive. Margaret stepped forward, holding the metal case filled with the copied documents. Sheriff Reeves climbed out of his truck and removed his hat. For a long moment, he simply looked at the mansion. Then his eyes moved to Caleb. "You want to tell me what happened here?" Reeves asked. Margaret stepped down from the porch before Caleb could answer. "Those men broke into the house," she said. "They were trying to destroy evidence." Reeves glanced at the overturned furniture inside. Then he looked toward Grayson. The wealthy landowner gave a slow shrug. "Misunderstanding," Grayson said calmly. Caleb's voice cut through the moment. "Those files in this case explain everything." Reeves looked at the metal case Margaret held. "What files?" Margaret stepped forward and opened the lid. Inside were the copied reports, photographs, and military records from the hidden room beneath Briarwood House. The sheriff picked up one page and studied it. His expression changed slowly as he read. Caleb spoke quietly beside him. "My father uncovered illegal weapons shipments moving through this valley 40 years ago." Reeves looked up. "The investigation led here." Margaret pointed toward the mansion. "He hid the evidence beneath the house." Caleb continued. "But the people involved labeled him a traitor and buried the truth." Reeves turned toward Harold Grayson. The older man's calm expression had begun to crack. "These documents mention your company repeatedly," the sheriff said. Grayson gave a thin smile. "Old paperwork doesn't prove much." Margaret lifted the photograph from the case. "This one does." She handed it to the sheriff. Reeves stared at the image of Daniel Mercer standing outside Briarwood House decades earlier. The sheriff took a slow breath. "You're telling me this entire town buried a federal investigation?" Caleb nodded once. Reeves closed the case. "That's a serious accusation." Margaret gestured toward the destroyed living room. "They just tried to erase it again." The sheriff turned toward the deputies. "Secure the vehicles." The 2 officers moved quickly toward the trucks parked in the yard. Harold Grayson watched them with quiet anger. "You don't understand what you're stepping into, Sheriff." Reeves looked back at him. "Oh, I think I do." The sheriff removed a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Harold Grayson's smile vanished. The wind swept across the ridge as the cuffs snapped shut. For the first time in decades, the truth that had been buried beneath Briarwood House had begun to surface. Weeks later, the valley looked very different. News reporters arrived from nearby cities. Federal investigators reopened Daniel Mercer's case. The files hidden beneath the mansion proved what Caleb had suspected all along. Daniel Mercer had not betrayed his country. He had been silenced for exposing a powerful smuggling network that reached far beyond the mountains. The official report cleared his name. The military issued a formal apology to the Mercer family. And the story of the hidden evidence beneath Briarwood House spread far beyond Raven Creek. Winter arrived quietly across Wolf Hollow. Snow covered the old fields surrounding the mansion, and smoke rose from the repaired chimney as warm light filled the windows again. Margaret had begun restoring the house properly now. New boards replaced the broken floors. Fresh paint covered the old walls. But one room remained untouched. The hidden chamber beneath the house had been preserved. Shelves of documents, photographs, and maps now formed the beginning of a historical archive. a place where the truth would never be buried again. One evening, Caleb stood on the porch watching the sunset fall behind the mountains. Atlas sat beside him, his bandage finally gone. The dog's coat had grown thick again in the winter air. Margaret stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Caleb. "Hard to believe this place almost disappeared," she said. Caleb nodded. "Truth has a way of surviving." Atlas stood and walked slowly to the edge of the porch. From there he could see the long road leading down the ridge. The same road where Margaret had first arrived. The same place where he had watched her from the tree line that first evening. Now the valley below looked peaceful, quiet, safe. Margaret leaned against the railing. "So what happens now?" she asked. Caleb glanced toward the restored windows of Briarwood House. "Now the story stays told." Atlas wagged his tail slowly as the last light of day faded across the mountains. Because sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is make sure the truth finally finds its way home. If you believe loyalty and justice still matter in this country, comment 1 below. Let's see who still stands for doing what's right. Stories like this remind us that truth might get buried for a while, but it always finds a way back to the light. And if you enjoy real stories about courage, loyalty, and standing your ground, hit subscribe and stay with us for the next one.